In a small, divided town, a teacher's life is shattered by a false accusation. One student, however, sees the truth and risks everything to expose it. A teacher's career is on the line, and the only person who can save him is the very student no one expected. What Maya uncovers will change everything, and it's more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Before we get into this unforgettable story, make sure you're subscribed to Epic Story Moments. Don't forget to hit that bell so you never miss another amazing tale. If you enjoy the story, share, and leave a comment. It helps us bring more heartwarming stories your way. And we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let's stay connected. Mr. Henderson had been teaching at Evergreen High School for nearly 35 years. His weathered face and graying hair a testament to his dedication. At 58, he had seen it all. Every shift in trends, every new generation of students, and the subtle undercurrents of societal change. With a reputation for being stern yet fair, he was respected by most of his colleagues, though some found his old-fashioned approach to discipline and teaching somewhat out of touch. He had his favorite students, those who excelled, who respected authority, but he also had a strong sense of justice, which made him a target for those who didn't understand his ways. Maya Williams, just 12 years old, sat near the back of Mr. Henderson's history class. She was quiet, almost invisible in the room, but her intelligence was undeniable. Her family had recently moved into the area from a nearby city, and she was still adjusting to the new environment. She wasn't just new to the school, she was new to the entire community. Her presence in this predominantly white, conservative suburb was a quiet storm in a town that prided itself on its unchanging traditions. The community was one that had always been slow to change, with subtle whispers of resistance to anything that challenged the status quo. The move to integrate schools had happened years ago, but there was still an air of quiet prejudice in the air. At school, the divide wasn't always visible, but it was always present. The subtle glances, the hushed tones, the way certain students were more likely to be ignored or overlooked, all of it was part of the fabric of this community, a community that wasn't ready for Maya Williams. Maya's first day in Mr. Henderson's class was uneventful, except for the occasional sidelong glance from her classmates. She sat in the back row, trying to shrink into her seat as much as possible. Her clothes were neat, but they didn't match the trends of the other kids, and her skin, darker than most of the others, made her stand out even more. But when the lesson began, Maya's mind lit up. She absorbed the historical details, the dates, the stories with a quiet intensity that Mr. Henderson immediately noticed. "Ms. Williams," he said, calling on her during a discussion about the Civil War. Maya straightened up, startled by the attention, but then she answered with clarity and depth. Her classmates looked at her, a mixture of surprise and disdain crossing their faces. Some of them had already made assumptions about her based on her appearance, and Maya could see the judgment in their eyes. But Mr. Henderson's approving nod made her feel slightly less out of place. Her habit of retreating into her notebook was one way Maya tried to make sense of her new world. She always carried it with her, small, leather-bound, and filled with pages of observations, reflections, and notes on things that fascinated her. It wasn't just a school notebook. It was a way for Maya to process the world around her, a world that often seemed complicated and unfair. She wrote about her classmates, about Mr. Henderson, and about the strange looks she received from the other students. Maya's words were more than just an outlet. They were a way for her to make sense of her quiet existence in a school that didn't seem ready for her. Her notebook had become her sanctuary, a place where her thoughts could be free from judgment. As she wrote, she observed, keenly aware of the tension that hung in the air whenever she entered a room. She was not just a student at Evergreen High. She was an outsider, a living reminder of the change that some people were not ready to accept. And as much as she wanted to fit in, Maya knew that it was impossible to ignore the divide that separated her from the others. Her notebook, however, was a small rebellion, a quiet act of defiance against a world that seemed determined to judge her. The trouble began innocuously enough. It was another typical Tuesday afternoon, and Mr. Henderson was holding class as usual, his voice steady and firm as he lectured on the Civil War. Timmy, a student who had been consistently disruptive in class, was his usual self, fidgeting, whispering to his friends, and rolling his eyes when Mr. Henderson would correct him. After a particularly rude outburst, Mr. Henderson called him to the front of the room. Timmy's eyes narrowed, and he reluctantly walked toward the desk, knowing full well that this would not end well for him. Mr. Henderson had been a teacher for decades, and he had seen every kind of student misbehavior imaginable. His approach was simple, firm but fair discipline. He placed a hand on Timmy's shoulder, guiding him gently toward the desk. "Sit here for the remainder of the class. I want you to reflect on your actions," he instructed, his voice calm and controlled. It wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Mr. Henderson had often used the same method with other students. Physical guidance, no more than a tap on the shoulder, a firm touch to get their attention when words weren't enough. It was never meant to be an overstep, but a simple way to maintain control in a sometimes chaotic environment. The rest of the class barely noticed the exchange, but it was a catalyst for what would soon follow. By the time school ended that day, the wheels of gossip had already begun to turn. Timmy's mother, already known in the community as an outspoken and overprotective figure, received a call from her son, his voice trembling. He told her that Mr. Henderson had touched him inappropriately during the interaction, a claim that was both shocking and completely out of character for a teacher like Mr. Henderson. Timmy, in an attempt to avoid punishment or gain sympathy, had twisted the truth, turning a brief moment of discipline into a fabricated accusation. Timmy's mother wasted no time. She called the school immediately, demanding an investigation into the matter. By the next morning, the rumor mill had already gone into overdrive. The accusation spread quickly, fueled by a combination of parental concern and the long-standing tensions in the community. Mr. Henderson, an older man who had earned a reputation for being somewhat distant and old-fashioned, was an easy target. The suspicion, particularly in this tightly knit suburban town, was fueled by existing biases that ran deep, prejudices against authority, especially when it came to men in positions of power over children. To many, Mr. Henderson was the type of teacher who might have a hidden side, the kind who, despite his many years of service, was still somewhat of an outsider in his own right. The whispers about him grew louder. The school responded immediately, suspending Mr. Henderson pending the outcome of the investigation. Parents rallied, some demanding that the teacher be fired outright, while others expressed doubts, but they were in the minority. The town's collective opinion was quick to solidify. Mr. Henderson had done something wrong. The details didn't matter. What mattered was the accusation. His reputation, built over years of teaching and dedication, was destroyed in an instant. His colleagues, unsure of how to handle the situation, avoided him or spoke in hushed tones. The weight of the community's judgment bore down on him. Maya, sitting quietly in her seat, observed it all. She wasn't close to Mr. Henderson, but she had always respected him, recognizing that he had a genuine passion for teaching. His disciplinary methods were strict, but they were consistent. Maya had always been a quiet observer, someone who listened more than she spoke, and she began to see the cracks in the growing narrative. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about the accusation, but as she watched her classmates, teachers, and the community rally around Timmy's side, she felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Her instincts told her that Timmy's story didn't add up. She had been in the classroom when it happened. She had seen the interaction between Mr. Henderson and Timmy. The teacher's hand on Timmy's shoulder had been nothing more than a gentle touch, an effort to move the boy into a position of reflection. But Maya, being an outsider herself, knew the risks of speaking up. She was already viewed as different, new to the town, the only black girl in a sea of faces that didn't quite resemble hers. Standing against the tide of public opinion would be difficult, especially when everyone else seemed so quick to jump to conclusions. Maya's timid nature held her back. She had always been someone who watched from the sidelines, someone who kept her head down to avoid drawing attention. But deep down, she knew that something had to be done. The injustice she saw growing around Mr. Henderson was painful to witness. It wasn't just a teacher's reputation on the line. It was a very principle of fairness, of truth. Yet, as Maya sat in class, feeling the weight of her own silence, she wondered how she, a 12-year-old girl with no power, could possibly change the course of events. The inconsistencies in Timmy's story began to gnaw at Maya. She knew the boy. He was a troublemaker, always at the center of drama. She had overheard conversations between him and his friends, conversations about how they'd managed to get away with things and how they could twist stories to their advantage. But no one seemed to question him. The town, the school, even his own classmates. Everyone believed his version of events without hesitation. Maya's notebook, a sanctuary where she recorded her thoughts, became the only place she felt safe to voice her doubts. It wasn't just about the injustice toward Mr. Henderson. It was about the larger, unspoken biases that seemed to control everything. Her words on the pages were quiet, but they burned with truth. Truth that no one seemed ready to hear. As the days passed and the situation grew more intense, Maya found herself wrestling with an unbearable choice. Would she continue to watch quietly from the sidelines, or would she find the courage to stand up, even if it meant risking everything? Mr. Henderson's suspension came swiftly, like a storm that hit without warning. He was escorted off campus that very afternoon, his once pristine reputation now reduced to whispers and stares. The investigation into the accusation was set into motion, but it was clear to everyone that the damage had already been done. The town, fueled by its own biases and prejudices, had already decided his guilt. His colleagues, who had always kept their distance from the older teacher, now avoided him altogether. No one knew what to say or how to act, and many felt that it was safer to turn a blind eye than to stand by him. The protests outside Mr. Henderson's home began the very next day. Angry parents, led by Timmy's mother, stood outside his modest house, holding signs demanding justice for their son. The chants echoed through the quiet suburban streets, a reminder of how quickly a community could turn on someone they had once trusted. Mr. Henderson stayed inside, refusing to speak to the crowd, his face pale and tired from the weight of what had happened. Every day, as the protests grew louder, the isolation deepened. He had been cast out, and with no allies to support him, it seemed like his life was unraveling piece by piece. At school, the atmosphere had shifted drastically. Mr. Henderson's absence was felt not only in the classroom, but in the very air of the hallways. Whispers filled the corridors, some of disbelief, others full of condemnation. "He's guilty," some of the teachers muttered under their breath, their eyes avoiding Maya's as she passed by. Even students who had once admired Mr. Henderson now looked at him as if he were a criminal. The once respected teacher had become a shadow, his name tarnished by an accusation that no one seemed to question. Maya felt it all. As she walked through the hallways, the judgment in the air was palpable. Her classmates had formed opinions without knowing the facts, and some had taken to cruel jokes, mocking Mr. Henderson's fall from grace. Maya tried to stay quiet, her presence barely noticed by those around her, but it was impossible to ignore the injustice. She could feel the weight of it, the crushing burden of an innocent man being dragged through the mud without a chance to defend himself. Maya's notebook had become her sanctuary. Each night, after the day's events, she would retreat into her room, taking her small leather-bound notebook out from under her pillow. It had been her trusted companion for as long as she could remember, and now it was the only place she could put down her thoughts. She wrote about the public humiliation of Mr. Henderson, about the quiet cruelty of her classmates, and about the suffocating sense of helplessness she felt as she watched the injustice unfold. Her words in the notebook were filled with questions. Asterisk, why is everyone so quick to believe the worst? Why won't anyone listen to the truth? Asterisk, she wrote about the inconsistencies in Timmy's story, about how the boy's account didn't add up with what she had seen in the classroom. But still, despite her doubts, Maya remained silent. She had always been the quiet one, the observer, never the one to speak out or make waves. The fear of standing up against the tide of public opinion was overwhelming, especially when she felt like an outsider herself. She was too young, too insignificant. What could she do to change anything? But deep down, Maya knew she couldn't just sit by and do nothing. As she wrote in her notebook, the words slowly began to build into a plan to find out the truth. The tipping point came one cold, overcast afternoon, as Maya walked home from school. She passed by the storage room near the school's gymnasium, where Mr. Henderson's class had been held that fateful day. For some reason, she slowed her steps, her eyes drawn to the small window at the top of the door. There was something about the place that felt off. She stepped closer, the crunch of gravel beneath her feet, the only sound in the quiet. The door was slightly ajar. Her heart raced, her pulse quickening as she pushed it open just a crack. Inside, she could see a pile of discarded papers, some of them half fallen out of a box. As she peered closer, a flash of color caught her eye, a small, crumpled note, clearly not meant to be seen. Maya's breath caught in her throat. She recognized it instantly. It was Timmy's handwriting. She reached out slowly, almost afraid to touch it, but then she pulled it free from the clutter. The note was hastily scribbled, the words jagged and uneven, but there was something crucial written on it, something that didn't match up with the timeline of events that Timmy had described to his mother. It was a brief message, but it was enough. The note revealed that Timmy had been in the classroom much earlier than he had originally said, that he had known about the teacher's disciplinary action before he had even spoken to his mother. It was a detail that contradicted everything Timmy had said about the interaction. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the significance of what she had found. This was the key, the small piece of evidence that could clear Mr. Henderson's name. Her mind raced as she stood there in the dim light of the storage room, clutching the note. This was it. The truth was finally within reach. But what should she do now? Should she go to the principal? Should she show the note to her parents? Or tell the school counselor? Every option seemed terrifying, and the consequences of speaking up were immense. What would happen to her if she became the one to expose the truth? Would anyone believe her? The quiet outsider? Maya stared down at the crumpled note, the weight of her decision heavy in her hands. The suspense lingered in the air like a storm waiting to break. The truth was finally in her grasp, but the real challenge was just beginning. What would she do with it? Mr. Henderson spent his days locked in the confines of his home, staring blankly at the walls of his living room, the weight of the accusation pressing down on him. He had dedicated over 30 years of his life to teaching, to shaping young minds, to guiding students through their education, and now, all of that seemed to mean nothing. His reputation, built on years of hard work and unwavering commitment, had been reduced to a single unjust accusation. It felt like a betrayal, not just from the community, but from the very system he had given his life to. He had never imagined that a misunderstanding could bring everything crashing down so quickly. His wife, Susan, tried to comfort him, but her own sense of helplessness mirrored his. She had seen her husband pour his heart and soul into his work, staying late after school to help students, even paying out of his own pocket for classroom supplies when the school budget was tight. She had always admired his passion for teaching, his ability to make even the driest subjects come to life for his students. But now, it seemed like all of that had been erased, overshadowed by the scandal. She sat beside him, holding his hand, trying to find the right words, but there were none. The community's judgment weighed heavily on her too, and she couldn't help but feel isolated, cut off from the support system that they had once taken for granted. The whispers, the sideways glances, the subtle but unmistakable coldness from their neighbors. It all compounded the sense of being exiled from their own life. Their daughter, Emily, who was in college, called every day. She was furious, but her anger was a double-edged sword. She didn't know how to fix the situation, how to make the injustice stop. She wanted to come home, but school commitments held her back. All she could do was express her frustration over the phone, urging her father to hold on, to not let the community tear him down. But each time she called, she could hear the cracks in her father's voice. He was the strong, steady rock of their family, but now he seemed like a shadow of the man he once was. He was slowly sinking into despair, questioning his worth, questioning everything he had stood for. The impact on the family was undeniable. Susan, once a source of strength for him, now found herself struggling to keep it together. She feared for their future, for the emotional toll this was taking on her husband. Their once peaceful home had become a battleground, filled with silence, broken only by the occasional outburst or tear-filled conversation. The strain was evident in their interactions, as the weight of the community's scorn began to take its toll on everyone. The notion of justice seemed distant, as though it belonged to a world that no longer existed. Meanwhile, Maya was carrying her own burden. Her discovery of the note had shaken her to her core. She had found the key to Mr. Henderson's innocence, but the realization of what that meant for her, what it could cost her, was overwhelming. Every time she thought about speaking up, her stomach twisted in knots. She thought about the consequences of her actions. What if she was wrong? What if the note didn't mean anything, and she was just imagining things? What if her classmates turned on her? Or worse, what if the community labeled her a troublemaker for defending a teacher who had been accused of such a terrible thing? The fear of retaliation was paralyzing. Maya's life at school had never been easy. As one of the few black students at a predominantly white school, she had always felt like an outsider. Her classmates, despite being polite on the surface, rarely made an effort to include her. She had always kept to herself, focusing on her studies and avoiding confrontation. She had grown accustomed to the quiet stares, the whispered conversations when she entered the room, and the awkward silences that followed her every move. It wasn't overt racism, but the subtle exclusion was still a constant reminder that she didn't fully belong. Now, with Mr. Henderson's life hanging in the balance, Maya's fears had intensified. She had witnessed how quickly the community had turned on him, how easily they had accepted the accusations without question. The thought of stepping forward to defend him, of speaking out against the tide of public opinion, seemed impossible. The emotional toll of past experiences with prejudice loomed large in her mind. She remembered the times she had been made to feel small, the times her intelligence had been dismissed, her voice ignored, simply because of the color of her skin. Would her classmates, who had already dismissed her as different, now turn on her for defending a teacher who had been accused of such a grave crime? Would she lose whatever small sense of belonging she had fought so hard to maintain? Maya knew that standing up for Mr. Henderson would mean risking everything. The friendship she had, the fleeting sense of acceptance and her own peace of mind. The possibility of rejection, of being ostracized, felt suffocating. Her notebook had become a place of refuge, where she could untangle her emotions and reflect on her thoughts. As she sat at her desk one evening, scribbling in her notebook, she realized that the fear she felt wasn't just about her own social survival. It was also about justice. She knew deep down that Mr. Henderson didn't deserve what was happening to him. The evidence, the note, could clear his name, but only if someone spoke up. The emotional struggle was tearing her apart. She wanted to do the right thing, but every instinct told her to stay silent, to stay out of the conflict. Yet, as she wrote, the words flowed more easily. She began to see that her silence was complicity, that by doing nothing, she was allowing injustice to continue. The realization was both empowering and terrifying. Maya stared at the notebook, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. What would it cost her to speak out? Could she find the courage to stand up for what was right, despite the fear of retaliation, despite the fear of losing everything she had worked so hard to hold on to? The tension inside her grew, her heart racing with every new thought that filled her mind. The road ahead was unclear, and the emotional weight of what was to come felt insurmountable. Yet, there was one undeniable truth that stood out among all the fear and uncertainty. She couldn't remain silent forever. The truth had to be told. Mrs. Carter had always been a quiet presence at the school, the kind of counselor who preferred to listen rather than speak. Her office, Tucked away in a corner of the hallway was a sanctuary for students who needed a safe place to talk. She was gentle with her words, never pushing too hard, but always patient, always kind. To Maya, Mrs. Carter had been a constant source of support throughout her time at the school, even though the two rarely had deep conversations. Maya would often stop by her office after school to chat, not out of necessity, but because it was one of the few places where she felt seen. Mrs. Carter had recognized Maya's quiet intelligence and had always encouraged her to speak up more in class, though Maya rarely took her advice. Recently, Mrs. Carter had noticed the subtle changes in Maya's demeanor, her withdrawn nature becoming more pronounced, her eyes distant as if she were carrying a heavy burden. She didn't know what was going on, but she could sense that something was troubling Maya, even if the girl wouldn't open up about it. Mrs. Carter tried to reach out, asking her about her classes and how she was adjusting to the school, but Maya remained guarded. There was a subtle sadness in her eyes that Mrs. Carter couldn't ignore, but without knowing the root cause of Maya's distress, she didn't know how to help. The counselor had always admired Maya's strength, but now she was beginning to fear that the girl was breaking under the weight of something far heavier than she could comprehend. One afternoon, as Maya sat in Mrs. Carter's office, the conversation turned to Maya's father. Maya had mentioned her father in passing, telling Mrs. Carter how proud she was of his work as a civil rights advocate. Mrs. Carter had been impressed by Maya's connection to her father's work, but hadn't fully grasped how deeply it influenced Maya's worldview. This conversation became a pivotal moment in Maya's emotional journey. As Maya spoke about her father's dedication to justice, she began to open up a little more, sharing stories of how he had always taught her the importance of standing up for what was right, even when it wasn't easy. Her father's work had always been a source of pride for Maya, but she had never fully understood the weight of it until that moment. She told Mrs. Carter about the marches he had participated in, the protests he had led, and the times he had faced immense opposition, yet never wavered in his commitment to justice. Maya's voice wavered as she spoke, the emotion in her words more powerful than she had anticipated. It was a moment of reflection, where she realized how much her father's example had shaped her sense of right and wrong. After the conversation, Mrs. Carter gave Maya a gentle smile, not knowing how much her words had truly resonated with the girl. Maya felt a spark of inspiration, a sudden surge of resolve that she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew that standing up for what was right, as her father had done so many times before, was a choice she needed to make. The fear still gripped her, but it wasn't as suffocating now. She had a clearer understanding of the kind of strength her father had drawn on throughout his life. He had fought for justice even when it cost him, and perhaps it was time for her to find that same strength within herself. Meanwhile, the people who had set this tragic chain of events in motion remained oblivious to the impact of their actions. Timmy, the troubled student who had accused Mr. Henderson, was a boy filled with anger and resentment. He was a product of a broken home, a young man who had faced emotional neglect from both his parents and his peers. Timmy had struggled academically and socially, and his bitterness toward authority figures had only deepened over the years. The accusation had been a way to lash out, a desperate attempt to regain control over a life that seemed beyond his grasp. Timmy's parents, too, were a source of tension. His mother, in particular, had always been overbearing and protective, unable to see her son's flaws for what they were. When Timmy came to her with the story of Mr. Henderson's supposed misconduct, she believed him without question, fueled by her own fears for her son's future. Her constant hovering and unwillingness to acknowledge his mistakes had made Timmy feel small and powerless, and now he had found a way to strike back. Timmy's mother had never fully understood the complexity of her son's struggles, nor did she realize how much he had contributed to his sense of anger. Her overbearing nature only served to isolate him further, making him feel even more misunderstood and alienated. When the accusation against Mr. Henderson was made, she latched onto it with a sense of righteous indignation, convinced that her son could never be at fault. She saw Mr. Henderson as the villain in her son's narrative, the man who had caused Timmy's emotional breakdown, and she was determined to make sure he paid for it. Her decision to push the lie had been fueled by fear. Fear for her son's future. Fear of losing him to a world that seemed intent on rejecting him. She believed that by protecting Timmy from the consequences of his actions, she was doing what was best for him, even if it meant destroying an innocent man's life in the process. Timmy's father, on the other hand, was more passive in the entire ordeal. He had never been involved in his son's academic or emotional life and had left most of the parenting to his wife. He supported her decision, largely out of a sense of inertia, never questioning the consequences of their actions. As a result, Timmy's parents had become an enabler of the lie, pushing the narrative forward without considering the harm it was doing to Mr. Henderson, to Maya, and to the rest of the community. These were the antagonists in the story, not villains in the traditional sense, but flawed individuals driven by their own fears, insecurities, and misunderstandings. They were products of their environment, just as much as Mr. Henderson and Maya were. They were caught in a cycle of miscommunication and misplaced priorities, each struggling with their own demons while inadvertently tearing apart the lives of others. It was in these tangled relationships, these mismatched motives, that the true depth of the conflict began to emerge, and Maya was starting to realize that standing up for justice would require confronting not only the lies, but the people who had perpetuated them. Maya sat alone in her room, the small notebook open before her. She had spent hours writing, trying to capture everything she had noticed, everything that didn't add up, the inconsistencies in Timmy's story, the way his account kept changing under pressure, the glances exchanged between his parents when they thought no one was looking. But the fear of being exposed, of the potential backlash, still gripped her. She couldn't afford to be seen as the person who accused a student of lying, not when the community was already divided, and not when she was already an outsider. With trembling hands, she wrote one final line. Asterisk, the truth is out there, but it's being buried. Please, investigate this matter further. A concerned student. Asterisk, it wasn't much, but it was enough. Maya folded the note carefully, her fingers shaking as she slipped it under the door to Mrs. Carter's office that afternoon. She wasn't sure what she hoped to achieve, but she felt a small measure of relief, knowing that the truth was at least now in someone else's hands. She couldn't bear the thought of living in silence any longer, but even more, she couldn't stand the idea of Mr. Henderson continuing to suffer for something he didn't do. For days, nothing seemed to change. The note had been taken seriously by Mrs. Carter, who immediately began asking questions. Maya could see the counselor speaking with teachers and administrators in hushed conversations in the hallway, trying to make sense of the details, but there were no concrete steps forward. Maya knew her anonymity was part of the problem. While it was the only way she could protect herself from being labeled a troublemaker or a liar, it also meant that the investigation lacked the personal connection needed to drive it forward. It felt distant, disconnected from the very heart of the matter. Without any direct evidence or a clear path to a resolution, the investigation quickly sputtered, leaving Maya feeling more helpless than ever. Maya had hoped that by speaking out, even indirectly, she could make a difference. But now, sitting in the same classes and seeing Mr. Henderson's continued isolation, the weight of the injustice grew heavier on her shoulders. She had done what she could, right? The note had been written. The investigation had been set into motion, but nothing seemed to improve. And yet every day, the same haunting question echoed in her mind. Was it enough? Her resolve faltered, and for a moment, she seriously considered walking away from it all. She told herself that staying silent was the safest choice. She couldn't risk everything she had worked for, not for a teacher who might never be cleared, not for a situation that seemed to be spiraling out of her control. But then, everything changed in a single moment. As Maya walked down the hallway toward the cafeteria, a muffled conversation caught her attention. Her instincts kicked in, and she paused just outside the teacher's lounge, her heart pounding in her chest. Two voices familiar, though not immediately identifiable, spoke in low tones just around the corner. "I told you, the story doesn't hold up," one voice said, sharp with frustration. Maya recognized it as Mrs. Carter's. There's too much that doesn't add up. We've been looking at this all wrong." The second voice, much colder and more calculated, spoke with a tone Maya immediately recognized. Timmy's mother. "You don't understand. We have to protect him. You don't know what he's been through. What Mr. Henderson did. It's not just about the accusation. It's about what happened before. The way he treated Timmy in class." The words hit Maya like a bolt of lightning. Timmy's mother had confessed. She had known the whole time that the accusation wasn't true, and yet she had driven it forward anyway. The pressure she had placed on her son, the distorted view of what had happened, had now led to a full-scale destruction of Mr. Henderson's career. The truth Maya had suspected was now crystal clear. It wasn't just Timmy's lie. It was a deliberate cover-up, fueled by fear and the misguided desire to protect a child who couldn't even see the truth of his own actions. Maya's mind raced. This was the moment, the one she had been waiting for. The truth had been revealed not through her note, but by accident, in the very words of the person responsible. Everything she had feared was now justified. But now, she had the power to do something about it. The weight of the decision was enormous, and for a brief moment, she faltered again. But this time, she didn't hesitate. Maya turned on her heel and walked swiftly toward the principal's office. She had spent too many days watching as the injustice unraveled. She couldn't back down now. If she stayed silent, the lies would win, and Mr. Henderson would pay the price for something he didn't do. Her heart pounded in her chest as she prepared herself for the confrontation. The decision had been made. She would no longer remain in the shadows. Maya was ready to face the consequences of revealing the truth, to take the stand that would forever change the course of her life, and of Mr. Henderson's. The truth was ready to come to light. But Maya knew that this would be no easy task. It would be a high-stakes confrontation, one that could either restore justice or tear apart everything she had worked so hard to hold together. But she was no longer afraid. This was a moment that defined who she would be. This was a moment that would bring the truth into the light. Maya stood in front of Mrs. Carter's office, her heart hammering in her chest. She had walked past the door countless times before, but now it felt as though it was a threshold between two worlds. She was no longer the quiet observer, hiding in the background of someone else's story. She had made her choice. She had seen enough, and now it was time to act. With trembling hands, Maya took a deep breath and knocked softly. Mrs. Carter looked up from her desk, her eyes wide with mild surprise when she saw the young girl standing there, holding her notebook tightly in her hands. "Maya," Mrs. Carter's voice was gentle but filled with concern. "What's going on?" I need to talk to you," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped inside, closing the door softly behind her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Mrs. Carter's gaze lingered on the notebook Maya clutched to her chest, sensing the weight of the moment. It wasn't just a notebook. It was the key to everything. "I've been writing everything down," Maya continued, her voice shaky but resolute. "The things I've noticed, the inconsistencies, the things that didn't add up. It's all in here." Mrs. Carter's brow furrowed as she reached out to take the notebook. She hesitated, knowing that by accepting it, she was stepping into something much larger than a simple accusation. But something in Maya's eyes, something about the way she stood there, vulnerable yet strong, told Mrs. Carter that this wasn't a moment that could be ignored. She took the notebook from Maya's hands and sat down at her desk, motioning for the girl to sit across from her. As Mrs. Carter flipped through the pages, she could see the depth of Maya's observations. Each note was carefully written, each detail precise. Maya had documented the discrepancies in Timmy's story, the way his parents' actions contradicted their claims, and the subtle but important clues that had been overlooked. It wasn't just a collection of thoughts. It was a well-organized investigation, one that tied together the pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered throughout the school's ongoing investigation. "Maya," Mrs. Carter said quietly, "this is incredible. You've been very thorough. But you understand, this is a huge step. If we present this to the school board, things will change. There's no turning back. Maya nodded, her eyes brimming with both fear and determination. I know, she whispered, but I can't stand by and watch Mr. Henderson lose everything for something he didn't do. I need to do this. Mrs. Carter was silent for a long moment, her fingers tracing the edge of the notebook. She had seen firsthand the toll this accusation had taken on Mr. Henderson, and she had quietly doubted the validity of the claims. But now, with this new evidence in hand, it wasn't just a matter of doubt. It was a matter of responsibility. She had to do what was right, even if it meant challenging the entire narrative that had been built around the situation. After a long pause, Mrs. Carter finally spoke. I'll take this to the school board, she said, her voice resolute. But we have to be prepared for what comes next. It won't be easy. There are people who will resist this, who will fight to keep the story as it is. Are you ready for that? Maya hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, her face set with newfound determination. I am. The next day, Maya and Mrs. Carter sat together in the school board meeting, surrounded by administrators, teachers, and parents. The room was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Mrs. Carter presented the evidence, and Maya's voice trembled but held firm as she explained her findings. As she spoke, her observations became more than just a series of disconnected facts. They became a narrative that exposed the truth hidden behind layers of fear, prejudice, and misunderstanding. Maya described the way Timmy's story had changed over time, how his initial account didn't align with the facts that had emerged during the investigation. She pointed out the way his parents had tried to manipulate the narrative and how their actions, intended to protect their son, had caused further harm. Maya's logical deductions and careful attention to detail left little room for doubt. As the meeting continued, the board members exchanged uneasy glances. The room, once filled with murmurs of disbelief, grew quieter as the evidence began to sink in. Maya's quiet strength and the precision of her observations were enough to cast significant doubt on the entire accusation. What had seemed like an open and shut case now looked more like a tragic mistake. A mistake that had been fueled by a combination of fear, misplaced loyalty, and an inability to see the truth. The tension in the room was palpable as Maya finished speaking. She had done what she could, had spoken her truth, and now the decision was no longer in her hands. But she couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. The truth was out there now, and for the first time, it seemed like the possibility of justice was real. As the school board members huddled together to discuss the next steps, Maya sat quietly, her heart still racing. She had done her part. She had brought the truth to light. Now, she just had to wait and see if the rest of the world would finally listen. The days following the school board meeting were filled with a mix of tension and anticipation. Maya spent most of her time reflecting on the events that had unfolded, replaying each detail of her meeting with Mrs. Carter and the presentation of her findings. The weight of the decision still hung heavy on her shoulders, but as the days passed, she couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted, something she hadn't expected. The accuser's story, once seemingly solid, began to unravel under the scrutiny of the evidence Maya had presented. Timmy's inconsistencies were glaringly obvious to those who had initially been too quick to accept his claims. As more and more people questioned the narrative that had been forced upon them, cracks started to appear in the facade of Timmy's parents. Mrs. Carter had quietly begun gathering more testimonies, and slowly, the truth was becoming clearer. Timmy's mother, once an impenetrable figure of authority in the school's eyes, had begun to show signs of panic. In a series of conversations, Mrs. Carter was able to uncover details that had previously gone unnoticed. Timmy's mother, in her desperate desire to protect her son, had fabricated a narrative that painted Mr. Henderson as a villain, a story she had used to shield Timmy from the consequences of his actions. As the evidence piled up, it became clear that the story she had told was not the truth, but rather a series of convenient lies. The community, which had initially rallied behind the accuser, now began to question their own biases. Maya's quiet courage had opened their eyes, and soon the whispers of doubt spread. More parents and teachers who had once blindly supported the accusations now looked inward, realizing they had been swept up in a narrative they hadn't fully understood. As these doubts grew, the foundation of the case against Mr. Henderson began to crumble, piece by piece. For Mr. Henderson, the transformation was slow but undeniable. In the beginning, he had been defeated, overwhelmed by the weight of the accusations. He had resigned himself to the idea that his career, and possibly his life, was irreparably ruined. But as Maya's courage spread through the school, he began to see a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just the evidence that Maya had presented that was shifting the tide. It was a growing sense of community. The way people who had once been silent were beginning to speak up. It was as if Maya had unlocked something in them, a desire to confront injustice head-on. Mr. Henderson, once a shadow of his former self, started to feel a spark of optimism. The hopelessness that had consumed him for so long began to ebb, replaced by a cautious belief that maybe, just maybe, the truth could win out after all. But Maya knew that the battle wasn't over yet. Despite the cracks forming in Timmy's story, there was still a long way to go. The school board had yet to make a final decision, and even with the evidence and growing support, there was always a risk that the community's biases could cloud the truth once again. Maya had come to realize that she couldn't afford to stop now, not when she was so close. With Mrs. Carter's help, Maya began to dig deeper, uncovering more pieces of the puzzle. They interviewed other students who had been present during the alleged incident, but had previously stayed silent. Some of them were afraid to speak out, worried about the consequences of defying the dominant narrative. Others simply hadn't known how to contribute, unsure of how their voices would be received. But as Maya's efforts gained momentum, these students began to find their own courage. They came forward with their own stories, adding weight to Maya's case. One student, Kyle, had been sitting near the incident in question. His memory of the event had been clear from the beginning, but he had been too intimidated to speak out. After hearing Maya's story and seeing the support she had garnered, he finally approached Mrs. Carter, telling her everything he had seen that day. His testimony directly contradicted Timmy's version of events, further discrediting the accusations. Another student, Sarah, had witnessed the way Timmy's behavior had escalated after a string of disciplinary issues, but had been too afraid of the social fallout to speak up. When Maya approached her, Sarah hesitated but ultimately agreed to tell her side of the story. Her account of Timmy's previous actions gave important context to the situation, showing that the problem went beyond what had been portrayed in the accusations. With each new voice added to the mix, the case against Mr. Henderson grew weaker. It wasn't just Maya's observations that were now shaping the narrative. It was the collective voices of those who had been silenced for so long, students who had once been too afraid to speak the truth, but were now finding their courage. Maya and Mrs. Carter worked late into the evenings, reviewing testimonies and organizing their evidence. They began to build a more complete picture of the situation, one that painted Mr. Henderson in a new light. A teacher who had been wrongly accused, yes, but also a man who had been unjustly punished by a system that had been too quick to judge. The evidence was undeniable. The truth, at long last, was emerging. As the school board meeting drew closer, Maya felt the weight of the responsibility on her shoulders. It wasn't just her notebook anymore. It was the collective courage of everyone who had come forward, the community that was beginning to embrace the truth, and the hope that the future could be different. But even as she felt the momentum building, Maya knew that the fight wasn't over. There were still those who would resist, those who would deny the evidence and cling to their preconceived notions. The final confrontation was yet to come, and it would be the hardest test of all. But Maya was ready, and this time, she wasn't going to let fear stop her. The days leading up to the school board meeting felt like an eternity. The pressure was mounting, not only for Mr. Henderson, but also for Maya. The community had been buzzing ever since the revelations began to take shape. Rumors swirled, and lines were drawn between those who supported Maya and those who continued to blindly follow the accusations against Mr. Henderson. The school board had scheduled a public meeting to address the growing controversy, and tensions were at an all-time high. As the date of the meeting approached, Maya could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders. The once quiet halls of the school had become filled with whispers, some of support, but many more of resentment. Her classmates, the ones who had once ignored her, now looked at her with a mix of disbelief and scorn. Her decision to stand up for the truth had turned her into a target, and the backlash came swiftly. "Why are you doing this, Maya?" Sarah, one of her former friends, asked, her voice filled with frustration and confusion. "You're just making things worse for everyone." Maya had no answer to that. She had known from the start that it wouldn't be easy, but she never imagined it would hurt this much. The support she had once felt from her peers had evaporated, replaced by a feeling of isolation. There were others, too. Parents who had become openly hostile, accusing her of trying to ruin the reputation of a good family, a good teacher. The more they accused, the more Maya felt herself retreating into her own thoughts, questioning whether she was doing the right thing. But then she remembered Mr. Henderson, the man who had stood by her when no one else had. She couldn't turn away now, not when he needed her the most. The fear and uncertainty gnawed at her, but Maya held firm. She could feel the support from Mrs. Carter and the few teachers who had quietly backed her, but the real battle was out there, in the eyes of her classmates and the community. The truth was still fragile, still easily threatened by the noise and pressure around it. The night before the meeting, Maya sat in her room, writing in her notebook. The words flowed easily tonight, a mixture of fear and hope on the pages. She wrote about what had led her here, how she had always been taught to do what was right, no matter the consequences. She wrote about the shame she had felt when her classmates turned on her, the quiet rage at the injustice she had witnessed, and the courage she was struggling to find. The next morning, the meeting arrived. The gymnasium, where the public forum was being held, was packed. Rows of parents, teachers, and students filled the space, murmuring anxiously. Maya and Mrs. Carter arrived early, trying to remain composed despite the tension that had been building all week. Maya's heart raced as she stepped into the room. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, some with curiosity, others with disdain. She found a seat near the front, next to Mrs. Carter, and sat as quietly as she could, trying to focus. Mr. Henderson's fate hung in the balance. Everything that Maya had fought for, everything she had done, was now about to be laid bare in front of the community. This meeting was more than just a chance to clear his name. It was a test of whether the truth could still rise above the prejudices that had been cultivated for so long. The tension in the air was palpable. The school board members began to file into the room, their faces stern and unreadable. The noise in the room quieted as they took their seats at the long table at the front. The moderator began to speak, but Maya couldn't focus on the words. All she could think about was what was coming next, what would happen when the evidence was presented, and how the community would respond to the truth she had helped reveal. Then, the board opened the floor for public comment, and the room became electric with tension. One by one, people began to speak, some supporting Mr. Henderson, others calling for his immediate dismissal. Maya could barely breathe as her classmates spoke, some defending the accusations against him with a fervor she hadn't expected, while others stood to vouch for his character. The opposition to Maya's stance was louder than she had anticipated. There were angry voices calling her naive, questioning her motives. The room seemed to swell with the heat of emotion. Maya's hands were clammy, and her heart raced in her chest. It felt like everything was teetering on the edge of a knife. Then, Maya heard the voice of one of the parents, a familiar voice from her class, filled with venom. "This is nothing but an attack on a family that has done nothing wrong," they said. "How dare a child from a family like hers destroy everything we've worked for? This isn't about justice. It's about tearing people down." Maya's heart dropped. She knew she was the one they were targeting, but she refused to let their words sway her. She took a deep breath, and with it, she reminded herself of the reason she was here. The truth was not hers to protect alone. It belonged to everyone. As the room grew louder, Maya stood up. She could feel the eyes of everyone on her, but this time, she didn't shrink away. She had come this far. She wasn't going to stop now. Her voice trembled, but was determined as she spoke to the board. "I have evidence that Mr. Henderson didn't do what they say. I know because I was there. And if the truth matters to anyone here, we can't let the lies stand." The room fell silent. For a moment, there was only the sound of Maya's breath in the space between her words. The eyes of the crowd were on her, some sympathetic, others hostile. The school board members exchanged looks, their faces still unreadable. The tension in the room was at its peak. Just as Maya spoke, a loud voice rang out from the back of the room. "You're just a child. What do you know about justice?" And just like that, the storm broke. The tension in the gymnasium was unbearable. The air was thick with hostility, doubt, and fear. Maya stood at the front of the room, her hands trembling, but her voice unwavering. She had made the decision to speak the truth, no matter the cost. This was her moment, the culmination of everything she had fought for. "I was there," Maya began, her voice shaking at first but gaining strength with each word. "I saw what happened, and I've written it all down. The truth is in my notebook." Her hands gripped the small, worn notebook that had carried her thoughts and observations throughout the entire ordeal. She opened it slowly, flipping to the page where she had meticulously noted the inconsistencies in the accuser's story, the details that didn't add up, and the truth she had uncovered. The room fell silent as Maya presented the evidence. Each observation she had made carefully articulated, the logical deductions forming a clear picture of what had truly happened that day. As she read through the pages, the murmurs of disbelief slowly quieted, replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. The accuser, Timmy, who had sat silently at the back of the room, suddenly looked stricken. Her hands were shaking, her face pale. For the first time since the accusations had begun, she was visibly uncomfortable. The weight of Maya's testimony, the undeniable evidence, seemed to suffocate her. Timmy's eyes darted around the room, avoiding the gaze of everyone who had supported her. And then, in a moment that shattered the tension, Timmy's composure broke. I didn't mean for this to go this far," Timmy said, her voice barely a whisper at first. She took a shaky breath before continuing, her eyes filled with tears. "It was my parents. They told me what to say. They didn't like Mr. Henderson. They said he was too hard on me, and they made me say things that weren't true." The room was in shock. No one had expected this. Timmy, the student whose accusation had set everything in motion, had just admitted that her story had been fabricated, her actions driven by her parents' bitterness and anger toward the school. The weight of her confession hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. Mrs. Carter stepped forward, her face a mix of sadness and relief. "Timmy, you've done the right thing now," she said gently, her voice full of compassion. "You've told the truth, and that's what matters." Maya, though exhausted, couldn't help but feel a sense of relief wash over her. The truth had finally been revealed, and the injustice that had plagued Mr. Henderson for so long was beginning to crumble. But even as the truth came to light, the reality of the situation began to settle in. The community had been divided. People had taken sides, drawn lines between truth and falsehood. And now, as the confession echoed through the gymnasium, the weight of guilt and regret began to seep in. The parents and staff who had so readily supported Timmy's accusation now looked inward, their faces painted with shame. They had rushed to judgment, had allowed their biases and preconceived notions to cloud their judgment, and in doing so, they had nearly destroyed a man's life. The guilt was palpable, felt by the teachers who had turned their backs on Mr. Henderson, by the parents who had whispered their doubts, and by the students who had condemned him without question. But amidst the guilt, there was also a sense of relief. The community began to breathe again, as if a great weight had been lifted. People began to apologize, to offer their support to Mr. Henderson, to acknowledge the harm that had been done. There was an undercurrent of guilt, but there was also the spark of something else, something that hadn't existed before. Respect. Respect for the truth, respect for those who had stood up for it, and respect for Maya, who had been the catalyst for all of this. As the school board members convened to deliberate, the room was filled with a sense of anticipation. The resolution to the conflict seemed clear, but the path to healing would take time. Mr. Henderson, who had remained quiet throughout most of the meeting, finally stood up. His voice, though weary, was steady. "I don't know what to say," he began, his eyes scanning the room. "I never imagined I'd be standing here today, defending myself like this. But I want to thank Maya. If not for her, none of this would have come to light." The room erupted into a quiet applause, a wave of respect and gratitude washing over him. For the first time in weeks, Mr. Henderson's shoulders relaxed. The tension in his body, the weight of the accusation, began to lift. It wasn't over. There was still the work of healing, the work of rebuilding trust, but the worst was behind them. Maya stood at the front, watching as the community reacted. There were tears in her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief. She had done it. The truth had won, and Mr. Henderson's name had been cleared. She had faced the fear of rejection, of standing alone, and in the end, it had made all the difference. The school board's decision was unanimous. Mr. Henderson would be reinstated, and the record would reflect that the accusations against him were false. But even more than that, a new chapter had begun for the community. It was a chapter that had been born out of pain and struggle, but it was also one that promised growth, change, and a renewed commitment to truth and justice. As the meeting came to a close, Maya walked out of the gymnasium with Mrs. Carter by her side. The tension of the past few weeks had finally given way to a sense of quiet triumph. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew one thing for certain. The truth had set them all free, and for the first time in a long while, Maya could finally breathe easy. The aftermath of the meeting was a mix of relief, healing, and quiet reflection. Mr. Henderson had been reinstated as a teacher, the school board issuing a public apology, acknowledging the wrongful accusation and the harm it had caused. However, despite the formal resolution, the scars of the incident remained. Deep in the hearts of those who had judged too quickly, in the awkward silences between former allies, and in the now revealed truth about the biases that had run beneath the surface of the community, Maya felt a sense of quiet triumph, but also the weight of the cost. She had stood up for what was right, even when it felt like the world was against her. The victory, though sweet, was not without its challenges. She had lost friends, faced harsh criticism, and had borne the brunt of a community divided by fear and prejudice. But despite it all, she had persevered. And in doing so, she had sparked something much larger than the events that had unfolded. She had planted the seeds of change. In the days that followed, there were subtle shifts within the school. Conversations that had once been hushed were now being had openly. Students began to discuss the concepts of prejudice, courage, and integrity in ways they hadn't before. Teachers, too, were more introspective, reevaluating how they handled accusations and judgments. There was no quick fix, no sudden transformation, but there was a quiet understanding that the events that had transpired had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their community. Maya, who had once been a shy, reserved girl on the outskirts of the school's social scene, was now a quiet hero. Her name was spoken with respect, even if it was in hushed tones. She had earned something that no one could take from her, the respect of those who had witnessed her courage. She hadn't been loud, hadn't demanded attention. She had simply done what was right, even when it was the hardest thing to do. And in doing so, she had become a model of integrity for others to follow. One afternoon, a week after the meeting, Mr. Henderson called Maya into his classroom after school. The room was quiet, the hum of students' voices fading as the last bell rang. Mr. Henderson was seated at his desk, a rare softness in his eyes, his usually stern demeanor softened by gratitude. "Maya," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to express what I feel. You saved my career, my reputation, and, honestly, my faith in the future. I've taught for over 30 years, and I thought I had seen it all. But what you did, it was something extraordinary." Maya shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what to say. She hadn't done it for accolades or recognition. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. But hearing Mr. Henderson's gratitude, his raw sincerity, made her realize the weight of her actions. "You don't need to thank me," Maya replied softly. I just couldn't let you be wrongfully hurt. I knew the truth." Mr. Henderson leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on her. "You showed more courage than I think most adults would. You didn't back down, even when the whole world seemed against you. That's something I'll never forget. And you've taught me something that I want you to remember for the rest of your life. Don't ever stop standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it feels like the world will turn against you. The truth is powerful, Maya. And courage is what changes the world." Maya absorbed his words, the weight of them settling deeply within her. She had never thought of herself as a trailblazer or a hero. She had simply wanted to protect what was just. But Mr. Henderson's words lingered in her heart, echoing like a promise. "I'll try," Maya said quietly. "I'll try to keep doing what's right." Mr. Henderson smiled, the lines of worry and doubt on his face softening for the first time in a long while. "I know you will, and you don't have to do it alone. The people around you, they'll see what you've done, and they'll find the courage to follow." As Maya left the classroom that day, the weight of his words stayed with her. She realized that standing up for what's right wasn't always about grand gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes, it was the quiet moments of integrity, the quiet acts of courage that made the biggest impact. In the coming months, Maya's story began to circulate beyond the walls of the school. Her actions had resonated with others, teachers, students, even parents, who saw in her a model of integrity and bravery. They began to examine their own biases, their own preconceived notions. Maya had become a beacon, not because she sought the role, but because she had chosen to do the right thing when it mattered most. The community began to heal, though the journey was far from over. It would take time, and it would take continuous effort to dismantle the walls of prejudice that had been built over years. But the incident had ignited a spark that would keep burning in the hearts of those who had witnessed Maya's courage. The moral lesson that emerged from this story was clear. Courage, integrity, and standing up for justice were not just noble ideals. They were the forces that could break down the barriers of prejudice, heal the wounds of injustice, and transform communities. Maya had shown that, even in the face of adversity, standing up for the truth was the most powerful act of all. And, as Mr. Henderson had said, it was something she should never stop doing. Because, in the end, the truth would always rise, no matter how deep the shadows of doubt or fear tried to bury it. Maya had learned that lesson well, and it was one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The days following the resolution of the case brought a quiet peace to the school, though it was a peace forged through struggle and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Maya's actions had become a turning point for many, igniting conversations about justice, courage, and integrity that reverberated through the halls. But for Maya herself, the journey had only just begun. As she sat at her desk one afternoon, the light filtering through the classroom window, Maya opened her notebook once more. The pages, once filled with quiet observations and tentative thoughts, now contained the story of her own bravery. The words flowed freely as she wrote, not with the apprehension of someone uncertain of her place in the world, but with a sense of empowerment and purpose. She had found her voice, and it was one that would never again be silenced by fear or doubt. Maya's hand moved swiftly, capturing her reflections on the events that had transpired. She wrote about Mr. Henderson, about the courage it took to speak the truth when it felt like no one was listening. She wrote about the importance of standing up for justice, no matter the cost. And, most importantly, she wrote about the power of kindness. The kind of kindness that had allowed her to see through the biases of others and act with compassion, even when it meant risking everything. The classroom door opened quietly, and Mr. Henderson stepped inside, a soft smile on his face as he saw Maya at her desk. It had become a familiar sight, her there writing, lost in thought. But today, there was something different in her demeanor. She was no longer the quiet, shy girl who had kept to herself in the corner. She was someone who had faced fear, injustice, and prejudice head-on, and had emerged stronger for it. "Maya," Mr. Henderson said gently, his voice carrying a warmth that only years of teaching could create. "How are you holding up?" Maya looked up from her notebook, her eyes meeting his with newfound confidence. "I'm good, Mr. Henderson. I think I'm finally starting to understand what you meant. About courage and integrity." He nodded, walking toward her desk. "You showed me something I'll never forget, Maya. Your courage inspired not just me, but everyone around you. And I have no doubt that you're going to continue making a difference, no matter where life takes you." There was a moment of silence between them, a shared understanding passing through the air. The world outside might never be free from its flaws, but in this small corner of the classroom, in the quiet bond between teacher and student, there was a sense of redemption, a new beginning. Maya smiled softly, her eyes glimmering with hope. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson, for everything." He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You don't need to thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing. Keep standing up for what's right. The world needs more people like you." As Maya closed her notebook and stood up from her desk, she felt the weight of the past few months settle into a sense of peace. The struggle had been long and filled with moments of doubt, but it had also been a journey of growth. And now, as she walked out of the classroom, she knew that she was ready for whatever came next. The final scene lingers on Maya's face, a reflection of the quiet strength and resilience she had found within herself. The camera pulls back, showing the empty classroom, now a symbol of the new beginnings that lay ahead for both Maya and Mr. Henderson. Their shared journey was far from over, but in that moment, they both knew that they had made a difference. One small act of courage at a time. The screen fades to black, and the final words echo softly. Courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, "I will try again tomorrow." The story, one of redemption, justice, and the quiet power of doing what's right, had come to a close. But the lessons learned would last a lifetime.